Hello, my name is Rayna Friendly, and today I'm going to talk to you about your upcoming USRA poster presentation. I know that in undergrad we really don't get a lot of chances often to create posters and present them, so I'd like to give you some hints and tips about how to create a really great poster and how to present it well in front of others at your upcoming poster session. Just a little bit about who I am. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior, and I'm just in my last year of my PhD. I've had a lot of opportunities to make posters and also to edit posters of undergrad students. So I'm really familiar with giving these pointers, but I am giving you a more science-focused information session. So this is really about how to do a science information poster. However, I do have some examples to relate it to social science. And a lot of these aspects can be related. You just talk to your supervisor or graduate students within your lab or your department for more ideas about how to make a poster session that works well with your research. So let's get started. So what I'm going to cover today is a little bit about what a poster is and why it is valuable to actually go ahead and make one. Then I'm going to discuss some typical sections you see in a poster. I'm going to give some tips on actually making the poster and how to prepare for your USRA poster session. Last, I'm going to give some hints on presenting the poster, some things to keep in mind when you're actually at a poster session talking to other people. And then you'll see at the end of this presentation there are some helpful resources and examples of posters in case you need some more direction. So first, what is a poster anyway? What are we actually talking about here? So here's an example of a poster that I made in psychology, and it looks a little smaller than it really is. It's about four feet by 4 feet or so, and it has some really interesting aspects here. You see that it has a title, it has background and purpose information, there's methods, there's also results, and there's conclusions and future directions. And these are some of the typical sections you'll see in a poster. And just a note that when you see posters in this presentation, unfortunately they might be a little bit blurry, and that's just because when I had to copy them into the presentation, they weren't the highest quality. But what I really want you to pay attention to is not the content of these posters, but the way they organize their information, the way they use imagery to display the information, and the way that they really try to reduce text sometimes so that you can really get the main point that the author is trying to portray. Well, when you talk about what a poster session might be, this is kind of what I have in mind. At a conference, in professional conferences, we usually go to poster sessions and posters are set up along these poster boards. And people come and walk by and look at different posters. And then people will actually come up to you at your poster and talk to you about what you did for your research. So this is a really great way to interact with others and explain your research to other people. Well, one thing you might ask yourself is, why should I even make this poster? Why is this a requirement of this research award? And what is the value to me? One of the values that might be more obvious is that you get to deliver your research to others. You get to explain it to others, get a chance to talk about your research, which gives you practice on how you might want to describe your research. But one thing you might not realize is that you're also going to get some really valuable feedback from those who are coming to see your poster. This is actually one of the things I find most valuable when going to an academic conference. You hear from others who are either in your field and who have really well-established views on your topic, but you also hear from others who are not in your field and can give you new views that you never thought of and some pointers you've never considered. So this really gives you some great ideas to take back with you when you're done about how to write and talk about your research. The next thing I want to talk about is just what makes a really great poster. So there are a couple aspects that I think really stand out about great posters. One is that this principle of less is more when it comes to text. Imagine that when you're giving your poster, you're doing a presentation in front of the class. And as most of us have experienced at one time or another with teachers at the front of the class, is it's really hard to listen to them talking while you're trying to read what's behind them. And the same principle applies here because you're watching someone deliver a presentation about their research while reading their poster. So you want to be able to follow along in the poster while they're talking, and that means reducing the text. And also, if I'm walking by a poster and there's no speaker, I'd like to be able to skim the poster to understand what the general point is. Another aspect that will help in this is to have images, and these are always better than text. Images that can represent what you're talking about will really help expand on what the researcher is saying rather than take away from it. And that way you don't have to read, again, what is on the board at the same time as you're listening to the person who is speaking. The format of a poster should really tell a story. It should explain what is known about your topic, what is not known about your topic, and then what you went ahead and did to solve these unknown questions about your topic. And then you'd want to also represent your findings, what you actually found, and then explain how that contributes to the body of research in some way. The best part of this poster session is that there is absolutely no wrong way to make a poster. You are not being judged in any way. And people just want to come around and talk to you about the research you've been doing for your undergrad research project. So although I'm going to go into some details about how to make more formal academic posters, you are free to actually make posters out of construction paper or Bristol board if you really would like to. There's going to be no penalty for that. But consider making a poster that you would like to see yourself. That's a really good principle to go by. One that, if you were walking by, you would understand the research project from looking at this poster. So let's talk about the sections that are in a typical poster. Posters generally all have a title, and this title should be short, attention-grabbing, but also descriptive of the research. If I'm walking by and I'm doing a project in something, for example, theory of mind, then it might be great to see the words theory of mind or similar terms that are used in that field in your poster so that I know to stop and read it. At the same time, you still want it to grab my attention and be kind of short and sweet. One good way to look at the types of titles that are generally used are to look at journal articles and news headlines for your topic. This will give you a good idea of how to phrase your title. Titles should also have the first letter of each word capitalized. This, of course, is not a stern rule, but does make for a good-looking poster. You don't want your title to be all in capital letters. That can be very distracting. And so I'll give you some examples on the following slide of what some titles might look like with this format. Some other information you'll want to include around your title are information about the author or authors, the department you're in, and your university affiliations. And the great thing here is you can actually use lab or department or even university logos on your title. The thing to remember is that the university and labs, they tend to have a very strict policy on keeping the dimensions of the logo consistent. So that means you don't want to stretch the logo vertically or horizontally. Rather, you'd want to keep the dimensions the same and just expand or contract the image. And you can definitely consult your supervisor or department about the use of the logos, But in this USRA poster session, you're representing the university, and so it is acceptable for you to use the university's logo. I'll show you again what that looks like in a minute. Another thing that you want to include either in your title section of your poster or at the bottom of the poster is your email address. This is important because often you'll end up giving printouts or send PDFs of your information to others, and you want them to be able to contact you to get more information about your research. So the really great thing about posters is that you can exchange research that's currently going on and that's not published yet with others. And in this case, you can go and actually ask other people for more information about research that's going on by using their email address. So I'll show you some examples of titles. And again, even though they're a bit blurry, I just want to give you an idea of what a title might look like. So in this case, you see that you have the capital letters of important words. Oh, sorry, the first letter of important words capitalized. And you have author information and departmental information. If you look at this one, you see that there's an email address in the corner, the place that the poster is going on or that the research takes place is listed. And here you see an example of the previous poster I showed you, where I have the logo from our laboratory on the poster and some images to show what the poster is going to be about, and then the affiliations at the top here and the title at the bottom. So there are many different formats to use, and it's just a matter of playing around with the format that you think looks the best on your own poster. I want to also draw your attention to this one in the middle. I got stopped in the poster session by this title, seeing the kitty carousel. It just attracted my attention so much I needed to read more, and it turned out it was a head-mounted eye tracker, but they used such a catchy phrase that I couldn't help myself and wanted to stop and find out about the research. The next section I want to talk about is your introduction, also your background, so you can call it whatever you'd like. But this really focuses on what is known about your topic and what's unknown about your topic. So when I'm saying what's known about your topic, what I really mean is there some theory or background research that's very essential for us to understand in order to understand your project and why it's important? So this is not a section where you want to just list all the information you have about a topic. That would be reserved more for a research article. In this case, you really want to emphasize the key terms that are important to understand. So for example, in my research, if I'm doing something on a basic theory, so I'm actually using a theory and a developmental process called perceptual narrowing. So I'd want to define what perceptual narrowing was before I went into my research on this topic. And you want to end the introduction or background with what's unknown about this topic. Where is the gap in the research that you're going to address by doing your project? This will lead very well into your purpose. Also, you could call it your research question or hypotheses if you actually have some guesses about what you might find. And so this purpose section can be its own little section after the introduction, or it can be included as part of the introduction to background at the bottom. Again, I'll show you some examples on the following slide. So if it's a purpose or a research question, this is going to describe what's the question of interest that your project is focusing on, or what's the goal of your project? What gap are you trying to fill in this research? If you're going to have some hypotheses, that's a lot of the time if you're going to support or refute a theory. You might want to say what your expected findings are if this theory is supported or if the theory is not supported. Again, remember that less is more. For this section, especially the section where you have a lot of information, you want to be able to have point form notes and also images where possible to describe your research. So here's an example of one poster, In this case, as I explained with the perceptual narrowing, I actually used an image to represent the narrowing and just had a little bit of information on it. And then at the bottom here, I had a one-sentence purpose of my project. Here's another example of a background study that just has 2 bullet points and then 2 main questions that the studying is addressing. The key here, you might notice, is the referencing. Referencing does not need to be in the introduction all the time, but it's great to have your references somewhere. So we'll discuss at the end the use of a reference section. You don't always need to use a reference section, it's optional. However, there should be some way to track down information about your topic. You'll see in this case, in this background example, Held in Hine 1963 is sourced for the information here so that if I actually get a copy of your poster, I'll know where to find my information. So the best thing to do is quote the reference in text if you would like to, or to have it at the end in a reference section, or both, depending on what suits your information well. Again, the main point is that if people get your poster, they should be able to find the information that you are talking about relatively easy. So after you talk about what's known and unknown about your research, you actually want to go into what you actually did for your project. So this would be in the method section. You can also call it approach or whatever makes sense for your particular project. So one thing you want to focus on is this section usually focuses on what is done by you. And a lot of times we have projects where multiple people are working on them, and you might be doing a project where you're just doing a little section of an overarching large topic. So in that case, you might want to either in your introduction talk about what's been done in the project so far, and then say for your methods what you did particularly. Or in your methods, you might want to go over what's been done generally for the overall project, but really focus your methods on what you're doing in particular and your role in the project. So one example that I have from talking to students actually doing this USRA poster session is what happens if you're making a methodology for a study that maybe you're not testing right now, but you're in the process of making it. You might want to focus your introduction on past methodologies used for this topic and why there's a lack in some way in their ability to do what you need them to do. And you might want to say how your methodology that you're creating is going to be valuable to your topic and what it's going to change and be able to do that the other methodologies did not do. So that's just one example. The key point here for any method section is to remember to only include the essential details. You're not going to have a large space to put this method section, and so we want to understand the key points that help us gauge what you did for your project. You don't want to include nitty-gritty details like maybe the specific type of computer you're using or the certain specific type of microphone. You might only want to include that information if you are in engineering and it's really relevant to your study. You can use subheadings if applicable, things like saying participants. So who's actually being tested in your study, if they're people or if they're animals or such. The stimuli or apparatus that you're using. So how is your study set up and how are you collecting the data? And then your procedure. How did you actually go about step by step doing your study? The key point here again is to try to use point form when possible and images. This is an example from a vision study. This is a typical way to display the different slides that subjects are seeing during like a visual experiment. So you see here, they see a series of slides in order, and this is the timing in between which they see each slide. And that would be an example of one trial. So that's a really creative way to display your visual study, and it reduces space, and a picture says 1,000 words. You really understand what the participants were seeing themselves. So let me give you some examples. From a more scientific example, this is a method section from that poster I showed you originally that has a table set up so that it's nice and ordered and neat. You have, in this case, two groups of participants. You have infants and adults. And then I have listed information about the participants in general, the actual stimuli that were being used, and then the procedures that were being used for each age group. And if you notice, there's very few words in this, and mostly pictures to demonstrate what I was trying to get across. Another example here has a series of pictures, and then just do bullet points about the methods. One thing I don't think this method section does extremely well is show you which descriptions go with which picture. So you want to make sure you have a really clear figure caption where it explains which picture it's describing, just like you would in a textbook. It's really confusing to see general information displayed where you don't know which picture or which image you are referring to. So from a previous USRA session, my colleague actually made this slide, which really gets a point across clearly. This is one way to do a method section over here on this left side. You see that there's a series of paragraphs. There's some information about participants at the bottom. And if I was trying to skim it, I probably wouldn't get too much out of it. But a better way to display this would be to set this up into subheadings and to make it bullet points instead of paragraphs. And all of a sudden, you can really see clearly that the top is some information about the stimuli that are being used. There's some information about the tasks and responses, the types of conditions that the participants are in, and then the participants that are being tested. And it's just so much more clear and easy to understand. And if I were to come to see your poster, I'd know which parts of the methods I'd really want to focus on. So I tried to come up with a social science example of how to do a method section because I got a lot of questions about this at the last poster session I led. One thing you might want to consider is that you're most likely going to be testing human participants, but you might want to know some information that you wouldn't want to know for a more scientific study. For example, socioeconomic status, information about race, any information that's relevant to these people and how and why you use them in your study. Then you might want to have a section about a questionnaire if that's the type of way you collected your data. The types of information you might want to include about a questionnaire would be the number of items or the length of the questionnaire, if it's divided into themes or topics or certain conditions, and then any other important and relevant information about what the questionnaire is really aimed to assess. If I were to do this in a visual way, using imagery rather than words or in addition to words, a way I might set this up would be to have maybe colored boxes with sections about the different themes of a particular questionnaire, if the key point about this questionnaire were the different themes. And I might have examples of quotations that that the questions were asked for each theme. And then that way, if I was coming to read this poster, I would really understand very quickly what the main point of the questionnaire was and the types of questions that were asked. So moving on to another section of a poster, this is where we have our results or our data or our findings. Now keep in mind you might not always have findings, and that's a case I'll discuss in a minute what you might want to do. But a lot of us will have something to say in the end, even if you don't have discrete data. So this is where you want to visually depict your findings. And what I mean by visual is you might want to have some graphs or charts or some other way to understand what your findings look like. So the key here is that they should be very clear and they should really communicate your findings well to the viewer. You might need to try a few different orientations or ways to display your data until you find one that is the best for your study to visually depict what you're trying to communicate. So in my case, I might have my bars in a bar chart set up in a particular way where my age groups are next to each other. But then I might try to reorganize it so that conditions within age groups are next to each other. You just want to play around with the format until it fits what you're trying to do. And I'll show you an example on the previous slide of what I'm really talking about. So, you can use graphs, but they can also be brain scans or other images, possibly a picture of an ancient artifact or something that you're studying in humanities. But what you really want to focus is on having very clearly labeled graphs or images. If you have axes, to make sure those really clear, and to have titles that are very obvious. You'd want to use distinctive markers and appropriate scales, which I'll show you in a minute. And again, you want to have some figure captions that are close by to your graphs or images so that we know exactly what you're describing, which picture belongs with which description. And in these figure captions, you want to summarize the take-home message of the actual graph or image so that someone who's coming by understands what they're supposed to take away from that graph. And you only want to have essential statistics. So you might ask, okay, what if I have statistics? What am I supposed to report? Usually, if you do have statistics, the really important point to report is your p-value or your significance value. I want to know if a distinction that you're showing me is significantly different or not. And you might want to consult your supervisor in this case to see if there's any other kinds of statistics that they find are relevant to report as well. Here's an example of a method section, a results section. And you see that there are some distinctive markers, such as little stars to represent significant results, as well as p-values. These are the significant values put right next to those significant results. Now, you'll notice it's a bit blurry, but I want you to get the gist of how it's set up. In this case, there's only one graph, so the figure caption underneath clearly relates to this full graph. And it relates the take-home message for each age group. So I have adults here and infants here, and I give the main take-home points for each age group. You also want to be able to play around with your order, as I was saying before. So in this case, this is set up by age group. I have 6-month-olds in this section, 12-month-olds here, and adults here. And I chose to set this up this way because I could compare directly the yellow bars to the gray bars. But you might decide, if you were setting up this chart, that you would want all the yellows to be next to each other and all the grays to be next to each other. So your graph should really display the key distinction that you're trying to portray to your audience. Here's a totally different type of results section. And you see here they actually use brain scans. So there are a whole number of results. There are 3 different graphs and then 3 sets of brain scans that the person is trying to present. But what they did is they actually sectioned it off very nicely so that you're able to see which descriptions go with which graphs, and there's a clear division between the set of results. So take a look at this example of what a graph might look like when it's not great. So on first glance, this graph looks fine. But then when you look closely and you try to decipher what it's telling you, you notice, well, one thing is it's really hard to tell apart the little filled in black dots from the not so filled in white dots. So it's really hard to follow which one represents old and which one represents young. Also, you take a look at the scale, it actually doesn't go in even increments. You have 1, 2, 4, 10, 25, 50, 60. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and you realize that this graph might not actually be representing your data the way that is most accurate. So here's a better way to describe the following graph. So here, now the markers are much more clear. We have a clear distinction between the filled in black dot for young and the white square for the old. And the scale is nice and even. And look how much that changed the visual description of the data. This one is far more accurate. And, they're just very clear axes labels and such. So keep these things in mind if you're making a graph, that you have clear axes and very distinctive label markers, and your data are represented in an accurate, easy to read way. Going back to a social science example of how you might represent your findings. Say I carried out the questionnaire that I was previously discussing, and I found out that responses were weighed heavier for one type of theme than for other themes. I might want to describe this in something like a pie chart, where I keep the colors consistent with the themes that I had described in my method section, but I make that into a pie chart showing the percentage of responses for each theme. If you don't have specific findings, you might want to say expected findings, what you expect to find if your study is carried out. So for the example of the methodology, if you've created a new methodology for your area, you might want to explain in your findings what you would expect to find with this new methodology, and if you expect those, and if you do find those findings, what it means. And also what you might expect if the methodology doesn't work. So next I'd like to discuss your conclusion section. You can also call this conclusions and discussion, or conclusions and future directions. Pretty much you want to describe what's going to be in this section. So in terms of conclusions, you should answer your question posed in your purpose section and relate it to your research question. So, blank was unknown about your topic, and after you've done your research, what do you now know about that unknown question? You'd want to be able to briefly explain what you actually found in your research, if you found anything, or even what you expect to find. And then you might want to relate this back to a general theory or previous research that was focused on in your background introduction. You really want to emphasize what it means, not just what you found, but what that implies about the big picture. Does it relate to something in the real world? Does it have an application? Or is it telling us something new and important and unique about the topic in the literature? So you might want to think, well, what's my unique contribution? And you want to be able to deliver the take-home message to the viewer. You want them to walk away understanding what the main point of your poster was. This section oftenly includes future directions as well, and that's if there is actually another unknown question left unanswered that needs to be studied after your research is complete. And another option is if you actually do a methodology. If you come up with a new methodology, you might want to explain, okay, well, for my conclusions, this method is really important because it adds blank to literature, but there's a lot of future directions. It still needs to be altered in a certain way. It needs to be used in actual testing to see if it's valid and such. So you want to see what is extremely important for the next step in the research in order to make a coherent story. Here are two examples of conclusions. Again, take home the main point of these in that the way they're organized is what's to be focused on, and less so about the content of these particular conclusions. So here you see a conclusion that is just one sentence long, and then a future direction that comes with a picture to describe what will be done next in the study. This conclusion section also has conclusions and future directions. They have a couple bullet points that are the main take-home messages, and then future directions of what to do next. Here's an example that doesn't have future directions. It's just 4 main conclusions that the author wants you to take away from the study. So this is the type of thing where it will be helpful to look at other types of posters in order to understand how conclusions are portrayed, and in order to see how you might want to talk about your conclusions, if you have any. So there are some additional optional sections that you can add to your poster. Acknowledgements are generally important, at least at the bottom of your poster. So this is something where you might want to acknowledge the funding agencies that contributed some money to your research for this project. And in particular, you guys will be at the USRA poster session, and you might want to have a funding agency listed for the USRA. So if you don't know exactly who your funding agency is, even putting funded by USRA would be an appropriate way to do this. But you can consult your supervisor to see if they also agree that you should put funding agencies down, or if they have a particular agency that they want you to acknowledge. So what you can do is actually just put this at the bottom of the poster, but you might want to have an acknowledgement section if you have many more people to acknowledge besides just the authors. So if you have a list of people who contributed to the project and you feel that they should be recognized, you might want to include a little section with their names and information. You can use a logo of your funding agency if you have one. And this can actually be in smaller font in some sections, so it doesn't need to take up a lot of space in your poster. Again, another optional section is a reference section. So like I said before, oftentimes people will include citations right in the text of their introduction and background about researchers who have come up with information that you are talking about in your poster. But you might want to have a separate reference section if you have a lot of references, or if you feel it's more appropriate, or it just fits better on the poster, where it could again be in smaller fonts and in its own little section. So I think I said these points, and so that is my general information on sections of a poster. Again, that might not be relatable to everyone doing a research project, so I tried to make it quite general. But if you are still trying to figure out how do I put my research into an organization, my suggestions are to talk to your supervisor for one, to look at examples of posters for online, which I will give you references for, and to also talk to graduate students who are in your area, if there are any, and see what they might suggest about how to organize your research. So now that we've talked a lot about the nitty-gritty details about the layout of a poster, we get to some more fun things about actually making the poster. So here's what I want you to keep in mind. It is so important that you start right away, because exams or midterms are in October or November, and usually the USRA poster session is around that time of year. So there's going to be a lot of things for you to do and balance at the same time. And you want to leave time for all the editing and practicing that will be involved in this poster session. It really does take longer than you think. I've spent just hours doing some simple editing and moving the layout of my poster around, trying to get it perfect. And if you're anything like me, you might be a bit of a perfectionist and want things to be exactly perfect. So it's going to take a little while to get that all done. And also, there's a lot of practicing and reviewing that takes place, as well as sending your information back and forth between supervisors or graduate students, and possibly doing practice sessions in your lab. So there's a lot to do. You want to start sooner than later. While you're making this poster, a good thing to do is to ask yourself, what would I like to read on someone else's poster? So if you were walking by another person's poster, what would make you stop and read it? If it had lots of text all jumbled, would you bother to read it? Probably not. But if it had some really neat illustrations and images and was nicely spaced and had a catchy title, it might actually make you stop and want to read it. You also want to think, what type of poster would I learn a lot from? So not only did it draw my attention, but did it teach me something? So here's some steps that you might want to take while making your poster. One is you want to kind of determine the story that you want to convey to viewers. A lot of time we have just lots of information, and it's hard to know how we really want to organize it and how we want it to come across to viewers. So you might want to write down some point form notes about the main points you want the viewer to be able to take home at the end of your poster. Then you want to make drafts of all the relevant graphs or figures you're going to use. The reason this is something you might want to do earlier rather than later is to kind of get an idea of how big your figure is going to be, and so you know how to set up your poster in which format. A lot of times these are the largest parts in our poster, and so we kind of have to design the rest of the poster around them. If you don't have any data yet or any findings yet, you might want to make up some fake ones just to see how you might display it. And then once you have an idea how you might display it, you can always add in your values later. You want to be able to summarize in point form notes your introduction, methods, results, and conclusions. And I suggest doing this in a text document, like a Word document, so that you can send it off to your supervisor to see before you add it in your poster. And that way, all the edits can take place before you start to accommodate for these sections on your poster. Again, trying to use bullets and images when possible to describe these. Once you have your text ready and edited, you want to start actually setting up your poster. And a really important step you got to take is to make sure your page dimensions in the program you're using are the right dimensions and appropriate for your poster. So in this case, your poster is supposed to be 36 by 36 inches. And I tend to use PowerPoint as my main method to do these posters, but you can also use other programs like Keynote and CorelDRAW, Illustrator, InDesign. But in PowerPoint, you would go to the page setup and actually adjust it so that it's 36 by 36 inches. And that way, you're working with an exact correct template of the poster. When you're doing this USRA poster session, you'll actually get some templates sent to you with these dimensions already in place, so that you'll actually not necessarily have to do this step yourself. Then what I suggest to do is to make separate text boxes for all the sections, your intro, method, results, conclusions, etc., and then place them on your page and start trying different layouts. A lot of the time it's just a matter of trial and error getting the poster set up in a really nice, neat, organized way, and you'll have to play around with it for quite a while. Generally, especially in a 36 by 36 inch setup, you would have about 2 columns, but if you had a wider layout, you might want to have 3 columns. And you want to really try to avoid clutter, so you want to leave enough white space, or space where there's not jumble of text, and instead nice clear division between your sections. Another thing you want to check in is if you're in a lab, you might want to see if your lab uses a standard layout for their posters. So they might have a poster layout that they need you to use. My lab has this, so they have a standard layout that we use for all the posters coming out of my laboratory. So here's an example of the layout that you will be getting sent to you. So this one will come from PowerPoint, and it'll have a 36 by 36 inch setup. And you'll see that there are 2 columns, and there's just suggested section titles here. But again, those will really be changed depending on what you want to show in your study. So again, this is the example I initially showed you that has that 2-column format. Another layout you might want to try using is a 1-column format. So here you might have background and purpose at the top and some results kind of at the bottom, but this will just be dependent on the type of information you have. This might be great if you have a little less text and more images. An example of a wider type of format that you might use would have 3 columns like this. And this one actually has the introduction, methods, and conclusions or take-home message at the top and the results at the bottom. And they probably have a longer, wide format of a picture. So here's a really great example of a poster that has very consistent colors, and they have really good division between the sections. You can very clearly see which sections are being shown. So when you're looking for some more ideas about the layouts that you can use, a good idea is to take a look at other posters that have been done. And you can visit phdposters.com and take a look in the design gallery. And there are just so many posters there that you could probably find one that's related to your work somehow or that has a similar format that you might want to use. You can also look at Pimp My Poster Flickr group and this F1000 poster repository. So there's some links to get you started. All right, a couple more pointers on actually making your poster. You want to try to choose good colors. So you want to opt for a light background with dark text because that gives really good contrast and is much easier to see than a dark background with light text. And the best thing to do is have some color but not too much color. Now, of course, if you want to print out your poster black and white, there's no stopping you, and it is a lot cheaper to do so. However, it won't be as visually appealing as having a bit of color integrated into your poster. You also want to choose good fonts. So this might be a good thing if you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what would someone be able to read? So some good guidelines are to have title being around size 80 font, headings around 54 to 60 or so, and then the text about size font 30 and up. 30 is like the minimum. That's already quite hard to see. So what you might want to do to test out if your font is good is to actually just print out some text at that size and then hold it about 1.5 meters away from your face and see if you can still read it, or at least get a friend to do that because then they won't know what it says. Again, you should choose an easy to read font as well. So Arial could be really good for your body font, and this doesn't have to be the same for the title. So titles I've used in the past have used Impact as a main font. The biggest point about a poster is that there's a lot of editing that needs to go into this. And you really need to check your fonts and your colors, your text, and your spacing for consistency. This will result in a very polished looking poster and is a really good practice for when you're going and making a poster for an academic conference. Also, you'll need to look at the spelling and content of the poster and try to continuously reduce the amount of text. So you might start off with quite a large set of bullet points or quite a large paragraph, and then always try to take that paragraph and reduce down the text and reduce it to bullet points when possible, and replace the text with images when possible. A good way to check for spelling and content errors is to print out your poster in just one sheet of paper, and then have yourself or your supervisor or a friend edit it for you. It's a lot easier to see when it's printed. Speaking of printing your poster, you might wonder where to get your poster printed. I wish I could show you how large these posters are. One really good piece of advice is to look at the posters printed off in your department by other people to get an idea of how big they are before you actually create your own. But while you're making your poster, when you're ready for printing, you should save it in multiple formats. You for sure should have a PDF format saved, or at least printers can actually save it for you in a PDF if you cannot. But most PowerPoints and other programs these days do have options to save as PDF. The printer I talked to actually requested a PDF form. He also requested that you leave at least 4 days for printing, and each printer will be different on their turnover time, but you have to remember that everyone else from USRA poster session also wants to get their poster printed. And if they're all going to the same place, that means there's going to be a lot of time that needs to be spent printing these posters. You might not get your poster in enough time for your session. So make sure to leave enough time and get it printed as soon as possible. I did take a look at a couple places, Staples, the UPS store, and McMaster's printing services. And currently in August 2012, the best deal is at the MSU Underground Media Design, which is in the Student Center basement at McMaster University. And they were able to set up a special deal with the USRA students to have a $38 poster instead of it being over $50. And they require it to be in a PDF format, but you can also send them a PowerPoint and they'll convert it for you to PDF. So you can take a look around, but this is certainly the best deal so far that I've found. I did a bunch of calling. And yes, posters are a little bit expensive, but it's a really, really good practice for future conference presentations to make one of these posters. And when you think about it, your funding from your USRA, from your undergraduate award, will cover some of these costs. So now we get to talk about preparing for the poster session and how you might go about doing so. The key thing to do is to be prepared and to know what's on your poster. Go over it ahead of time and rehearse it, and so you know what you want to say about it. You'll also want to prepare an email sign-up sheet. So this is something you don't usually think about, but the whole point of a poster session is that people might be able to obtain copies of your poster and then have some information about your research before it's published. And at a real academic conference, these can sometimes be in the form of actually printed out pieces of paper. But since you're at a USRA poster session, and the people that are going to come see your poster are probably a combination of your supervisors and supervisors from other departments or faculties, they might not be as interested in having a copy. So it's best to leave a sign-up sheet for them to decide whether or not they want to be sent a copy of your poster. And the greatest thing about these poster sessions is you can actually bring props or materials relevant to your research. So if you were doing something like a historical study on ancient artifacts, you might want to bring in some of those artifacts or fabrics in with your poster session to show people when they come around. You might have some sound files or some video files that you want to show others. And nowadays, with the use of technology, having laptops and iPads and MP3 players, this is a very possible thing to do. You can actually have files from your research project ready to show others. Rehearsing and talking through your poster will be one of the key factors of making a very smooth presentation for your poster session. So the more you go over it, the more you will know how you like to phrase it, and the more comfortable you will be with what is on your poster, and the more professional you'll sound. You'll sound much more clear. One thing you might want to do is create a couple different versions of talking through your poster. You would want to have prepared a full walkthrough in case someone wants to know all about your introduction, your methods, the types of data you used, the conclusions, and the take-home messages. But you might want to also have some shorter versions prepared in case someone doesn't want to sit through a whole talk. The poster sessions are only about 2 hours, and it's impossible to listen to, a 10-minute presentation for each person at this conference. So You might want to have a 5-minute presentation prepared where you just cover your main goals, a short version of your methods, the general results, and take-home message that you want the viewer to attain. And you might even go further and think of a 2-minute blurb. Someone wanted just like a really quick run-through. You might want to tell them the main goals of your study, the main things you found, and the take-home messages. And that's about it. You also want to consider how your explanations might differ if you're describing your study to an expert or someone who's knowledgeable in the field, compared to someone who's a novice who really isn't familiar with this line of work. The types of terms you use and the aspects you focus on will be different for these different groups. And part of the great thing about a poster session is it gives you practice talking to different people with different backgrounds about your research. When it gets to presenting your poster, it's important to keep in mind that you don't need to be scared, because really it's just a conversation between you and someone else about your research. It's actually one of my favorite things to do at a conference, because instead of doing a formal presentation when I only can take a couple questions at the end, and those questions are analyzed and scrutinized by everyone, here I get to talk to someone one-on-one and really ask them what they'd like to know about my research and just tell them a little bit about it and have a conversation about why it's important and what it means. So when you're presenting your poster, a good first step is to find out about your listener's background and interests, and to adjust your presentation accordingly. So you might want to ask, are you familiar with this line of research? So you know if you should give a more abbreviated introduction or go into more detail about the general theory or information behind your area. You can also ask if they'd like the full walkthrough or if they just want a quick review of what's on your poster. So knowing these types of things will really help you decide which of your prepared versions, your short run-through, your long overview, your expert or your novice edition, really should be delivered to this person. And your goals when presenting the poster are to interest the other person, to inform them about your research, to teach them something, and actually persuade them that your research is valuable and unique and contributes to the literature significantly. You might be wondering yourself if this is the case. Is my research really that important? Does it contribute? But yes, if you're doing a research project, it is definitely valuable in some way because your supervisor encouraged you to do it. And so your goal is to find out for yourself why it's valuable and interesting and unique, and persuade the other person that it is so. You want to be able to sell your story and be enthusiastic. There's probably nothing worse than going to a poster session and talking to someone who is really bored and not interested in their research. This rarely happens. I find most people love to talk about their research. But you might want to think about the type of person you'd want to talk to. Someone who can really get you excited about their research would be fun to talk to. And so you should really try to aim to have fun with this poster session. Also, you want to not forget to read the body language of your listener. You might not think to do this because you might be concentrating so hard on delivering your research. But, the listener might want to interject with a question. Or they might want to run away to go talk to another student that they're trying to get to before the time is up. Or they might need to, use the bathroom. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to be watching for certain body language signs from your viewer to understand if they are very engaged in listening. If they look like they're confused, you might want to ask them if they want you to better explain a certain concept. Okay, so one thing you might also not think about is that you really need to be open to feedback during this session. So you're going to have a lot of people coming by and telling you what a great job you did and how interesting your research is and that your poster is just fantastic. But you'll probably also have one or two people that question what you're telling them, that question your findings, that question your methods, that give you some constructive criticism. And it's important to be open to that. That doesn't mean that if someone tells you that your findings might not be accurate, that you can't argue back scientifically that they might not be correct either. But you want to not be shutting people down and making them feel bad for having ideas and new thoughts about your research. A lot of these constructive criticisms have been the most valuable for me when going to academic conferences in trying to anticipate the kinds of questions I'm going to be getting from others about the research that I'm doing. Last, you want to make sure you look neat and you speak clearly and you thank the listeners for coming. So when I say look neat, actually there's no dress code for this poster presentation. You are able to wear whatever you'd like and whatever makes you feel comfortable. However, you are representing the university and your supervisor, so you want to look neat and presentable. And yes, thanking the listeners for coming is very important because you want them to know that you appreciate their interest in your poster. Another set of information about this poster session is how it's going to be set up. So actually, the way these poster sessions have been run in the past and that the way they're going to be run in 2012 is that they're going to be organizing people by themes. So your poster will generally be by other posters that are similar to it. And so that means that you're going to be able to view other posters that you might want to go look at. So you might ask yourself, what's the policy on me leaving my poster to go read other people's posters? Well, at academic conferences, it's perfectly acceptable to step away from your poster for a short period of time to go look at other people's posters because they understand that sometimes that's your only chance to do so. You will be getting a booklet with your picture on it, a picture of all the USRA students, and also information about each person's poster. So you have abstracts of all the posters and the poster numbers. My suggestion is to look through this book while you're getting prepared for the session or during your session. And if you have any posters you'd like to go see, circle them so that you can go take a few minutes, step away from your poster, look at some other people's posters, and come back to yours when you're finished. So that is possible, but again, since the poster session will be organized in themes, hopefully the people's posters that you want to see will be close by to yours. So to end this information session, I'd like to give you some general places to go to find out about making posters and poster presentations. So you can actually go and get some good poster making tips at the links listed here. And these can be sent around to you when you're doing your poster session. So if you have any queries, you can let the organizers know. But hopefully this has been helpful to you, and hopefully you're not too nervous about making this poster. I know it can be a very scary process, especially if you've never done it before, but the key to remember is that you're not being judged. This is just for your benefit to learn how to talk about your poster and to get information back from others and to celebrate all of your very hard work that you did for this research award. And you should just congratulate yourself and have fun at the poster. And I hope you learned a lot from the session. Thank you very, very much.